Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Lauren Izo. And coming up in this edition, is a secret Israeli delegation in Sudan to talk peace? Trump's last-minute push for another country to join the Abraham Accords. After violence this week leaves 2 women dead at the hands of their husbands, Israelis are wondering, when will enough be enough? And the oldest Jewish museum in Germany is reopening after 5 years and 50 million euros. We'll hear more from the mayor of Frankfurt. If you ask U.S. President Donald Trump or Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Abraham Accords are far from over, and more countries are on the way to normalization with Israel. Sudan, for one, has been at the top of Trump's agenda, and he insists they will be among the next to join the Accords. According to reports from Israeli radio, an Israeli delegation flew to Khartoum on Wednesday for rare secret talks. Intelligence Minister Eli Cohen told Israeli television that he believes Israel is very close to normalization with Sudan. Earlier on Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that the U.S. was working to remove Sudan from its terror blacklist and also working diligently to secure a deal with Israel.
We also are continuing to work to get every nation to recognize Israel, the rightful Jewish homeland, and to acknowledge their basic fundamental right to exist as a country. That certainly includes Sudan, and we are working diligently with them to make the case for why that's in the Sudanese government's best interest to make that sovereign decision.
Now let's delve into this story with Professor Ephraim Inbar, president of the Jerusalem Institute of Strategy and Security. Thank you, sir, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Well, Trump, made a deal with Sudan that if they pay the victims of terror attacks, they could be removed from this terror blacklist. Was this all just a plot to get closer to normalization with Israel?
Definitely not. This is part of the American policy for many years already. And President Trump implements a long-standing American foreign policy vis-à-vis Iran, vis-à-vis Sudan. At the same time, of course, President Trump and his administration are committed to a peace process between Arab countries and Israel, and they try to include Sudan in this process as well.
Professor, it seems like Khartoum is maybe pushing back a little bit, first firing a minister who spoke about it without permission, and everything is being kept under wraps. Is this creating more chaos than it's worth, or will there actually be a deal in the end?
Well, I don't know if there will be a deal at the end. We are in the Middle East after all, but we should recognize the fact that Sudan is ruled by a coalition of military people and civilian politicians. And there are some differences between those two groups. The military group is more in favor of normalizing relations with Israel, while among the civilian politicians, there are people that think that the Palestinian issue should be given precedence and Sudan should normalize relations only following a Palestinian-Israeli deal. So there is an internal debate about when to normalize relations in Israel, and we have to be patient and to see what is the outcome of this internal debate.
And I wonder, sir, if this deal is made, what is in it for Israel and what could be in it for Sudan?
Well, for Israel, it is an important deal. First of all, any Arab countries that makes peace with Israel is Israeli advantage and Israeli success. Second, the location of Sudan is very important. If we take a look at the map, it's along the Red Sea, and it will create, together with Egypt and Eritrea, a land corridor which is ruled by non-Islamist countries. The Red Sea is an important sea lane for us. Moreover, Sudan's location is critical for air links between Israel and Latin America. And if the skies of Sudan are opening up, it will shorten the air flight hours from Israel to Latin America. This Latin America could become an important market for Israel.
Now, as far as the U.S. president's involvement, do you see this as any kind of last-minute push ahead of the presidential election? And do you think the outcome will depend on whether or not Trump is reelected?
Well, I think that Trump tries to achieve foreign policy successes before the election. Trump, like any other politician, always thinks about elections. And I think this last effort by the American administration is obviously connected also to what's happening in domestic American politics. But we should recognize that this is not a new policy by the president. President Trump.
We will definitely all be watching on November 3rd to see what happens in that election. Ephraim Inbar, thank you so much for your insight.
You are welcome.
Moving on now, an Israeli police officer has been charged with reckless killing in the deadly shooting of a Palestinian man with autism in Jerusalem earlier this year. That shooting took place around the same time an African-American man, George Floyd, was killed by U.S. police, leading to a mass Black Lives Matter protest movement. Simultaneously in Israel, protesters of this incident held signs saying Palestinian lives matter. 32-year-old Iyad Halak, a resident of East Jerusalem, was heading to his school for students with special needs when he was killed. The officer being charged was not identified, and Halak's family has criticized the investigation. While the fight to protect women from violence is raging throughout Israel, thousands protesting across the country on Wednesday following the Monday murders of 2 women, allegedly by their husbands. Naja Mansour, 35 years old, was found dead in her Kiryat Chaim apartment with signs of physical violence. A few hours later in Beersheva, police found the body of 67-year-old Rina Garbinov in her apartment after her husband allegedly beat her to death with a hammer. Now, I want to discuss this further, so joining us is Anat Nir from Ani Isha, the advocacy group behind the protests. Thank you so much for joining me on this important issue.
Thank you for having me.
Well, firstly, I wanted to ask you, if you could explain to us, what are the red flags that a relationship might be abusive, and at what point should a woman actually be concerned? And if she is, in Israel, what options does she have?
So there are red flags in violent relationships. There are red flags for the women themselves. If you feel like you're hiding things, if your partner asks you to say different things outside and inside the relationship, if you feel like you're walking on eggs, if you feel like you're very tense toward the meeting with your partner, do you find yourself doubting your sense of judgment? Do you try to remind yourself what you actually love about him? Do you find that you are about to be beaten and you feel like you're threatened even though there are not yet maybe violence, or there is violence, physical violence as well? Did he hurt something that you like, an object, a pet, a kid? Did he humiliate you? Did he use humiliating words? Did you not go to social meetings that you wanted to go to because you felt like you had to hide something?
Right, so if they're experiencing all of these signs, where should they turn?
Well, there's all the lines for, there are many numbers, but you can Google the lines. But of course, in every city, you always have 118, which is a line in every city that you can call. And of course, you can also call the police, and you can also address the welfare in your city. You can Google, violence towards women, and you can always get hotlines and numbers. We have now started delivering those numbers in many methods, so women will have more access to the numbers. So that's one thing. The other thing is for us, the public. If you hear something from the flat next to you, don't be shy. Don't feel like you're shoving your nose into business that are not your business. Just knock on the door, make sure that someone is feeling safe enough, because that's how the murder in Mitzpe Ramon was prevented, by a neighbor that was stubborn enough to stop the man from killing a woman there.
Annette, we know that cases of domestic violence have increased during the coronavirus pandemic. Why is that?
Well, people are in a stressing environment. They're used to going outside to work or being in the public sphere, and now everybody is in the private sphere, in the domestic space, and it creates tensions that people have not known before. Maybe some people have less money and are more tending towards pressure, and that increases by 100% the amount of domestic violence in Israel and also in other places in the world. But we know from the Israeli police that the numbers are very, very high, and they actually called us to get some advice. So we should know that this is a very hard time for women and for families.
I wonder if you could describe to us the sort of demographic that is coming out to these protests. What parts of Israeli society are most affected by this issue, and which ones are coming out to the protests?
Well, of course, the most affected by issues of violence are people who are more from communities that are in general are weaker. So we see more violence in Russian, Ethiopian, Arab society. And of course, that I want to say, it's important to say in the same sentence, we see Jewish women from Ashkenazi origins, from richer cities also being murdered, and also that they're experiencing violence. So it's not only that communities that are marginalized experiencing domestic violence, it's all over the world and all over Israel, in all societies, in all walks of life, in all professions. Women were working outside of their house with careers, were Ashkenazi Jewish origins, also experience violence. It's very important to say it. But of course that, communities that are more marginalized and marginalized groups experience more violence, and they get less justice.
Annette, we have very little time left, but I wonder if you could just, for all the people watching that might, find themselves in a situation like this, what is your best piece of advice?
Please call for help. Also, men, I want to tell men, if there's only 1 minute, I want to tell men, if you're experiencing some kind of trouble, if you're feeling that you say something and you regret it later, there is a hotline for men. You can call the hotline, and just so you know, 60% of the men who get self-help, they don't go into the violent circle afterwards. So please call for help. We are there for you.
A really, really important issue. Annette Nir, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's move on now. Deja vu. Israel is still in the process of exiting its second nationwide lockdown, more than a month into it. And there is no telling when all the restrictions will finally disappear for the time being. Even the Prime Minister had to celebrate his birthday via Zoom. Here's the story.
After 6 hours of deliberations on Wednesday, ministers failed to reach a decision on the next steps in the move out of Israel's coronavirus lockdown. But Israel's COVID-19 cabinet meeting did include a special surprise for the prime minister in honor of his 71st birthday. During the meeting, Netanyahu proposed that the country's exit strategy, currently consisting of 9 stages, should be reduced to only 5.
לעבור משלב לשלב בהדרגה. לא יהיו 9 שלבים, יהיו פחות שלבים, אבל הם יהיו מדורגים. והדבר השלישי, אם נראה שיש עלייה בחזרה, כמו שקורה עכשיו במדינות אירופה, נאלץ להחזיר בחזרה חלק מההגבלות.
Israel's COVID-19 Commissioner Roni Gamzu arguing that exiting the lockdown should be even more gradual. The exit strategy's second stage is supposed to come into effect Sunday. If the rate of infection remains low and the number of new daily cases does not exceed 1,000, that could include the opening of grades 1 through 4. But a final decision regarding the reopening of schools and shops will be made next week.
אני מבקש את שיתוף הפעולה שלכם, כי ביחד נצליח.
Until then, here's where the country stands. Since Wednesday, there were 1,089 new cases. 231 patients are on ventilators, and the death toll stands at 2,292. Nittany Manson, ILTV.
So it looks like we're not coming out of it just yet. And one industry that has been hit exceptionally hard is the film industry. Now Israel's cinemas are reporting they may never be able to reopen. Having been closed since the beginning of the first lockdown in mid-March, movie theater owners say if they can't open relatively soon, even the biggest chains could collapse. it being the only industry that has been forced to remain closed for 7 months straight. Theater owners say their creative solutions like drive-in movies have only been met by rejection from the government, who has given the industry the bare minimum in funding since the beginning of the pandemic. They say they are out of options. Now let's move to Frankfurt. The oldest Jewish museum in Germany's history is reopening after 5 years and 50 million euros of renovations and a special installation by an Israeli artist. Take a look at this special project.
We are obviously standing on a construction site, and this is the construction site of the new Jewish museum.
After 5 years of rebuilding and renovation costing around 50 million euros, the new Jewish Museum of Frankfurt finally reopened to the public this week.
As a Jewish museum, we are approached with all kinds of prejudices and all kinds of feelings. So we wanted at the center of our new entrance a sculpture and a work that opens up something for everyone. And I guess this is what Ariel Schlesinger's sculpture will do.
The museum is located on Bertha Pappenheim Platz, a plaza named after a women's rights activist and founder of the Jewish Women's Federation. On the square sits an overturned fig tree sculpture made of aluminum, designed by the Israeli artist Ariel Schlesinger.
Along the way, when I was explaining the idea, I noticed that I again and again keep doing this gesture of putting one tree on top of the other tree. One hand holding another hand.
Schlesinger says he hopes each time visitors see the sculpture, they will learn something new about it.
He took the tree as a multi-layered symbol and set the scene of a very special, even dramatic composition. The sculpture of two casted trees, from which one seems to have been through something like a catastrophe.
Schlesinger took inspiration from Jewish history, his own personal family history, and the Jewish Bible as he designed his unique work for the museum, which he hopes will remain for generations to come.
Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Uwe Becker, the mayor of Frankfurt, who attended the opening of that museum. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, and all the best, and shalom to Israel.
So the museum took 5 years to complete and cost around 50 million euros. Why was this museum needed, and who is behind funding it?
Well, this museum is, or was, I say, the first Jewish museum in Germany when it first opened in 1988. And the decision was laid in the past decade to renovate and to enhance it. And now it has double the size of it originally had. And from the first Jewish museum in Germany, it is now the most modern Jewish museum in the world. And the reason for this is because Frankfurt is the most Jewish city in Germany. And the contribution of Jewish life has been so strongly to the development of the city and the whole region that the decision was laid 1 decade ago that we should forward it to the next generation, and they should interpret what is necessary to be told to our present generation.
I'm sure you got a chance to see that beautiful sculpture by Israeli artist Ariel Schlesinger. What did you think about it?
Well, it is in a very strong emotional way explaining from taking the roots away from a place where Jewish roots have been here for centuries. And it explains the way from the past to the future in such a, if I could say wonderful, but at least in a such emotional way that no other piece of art, to my mind, could have shown it in this very strong and dynamic form. And especially as it's also placed in between the old and the new part of the museum. So it has many forms of explanation to Jewish life and to the story that we want to tell there in a magnificent way.
So in addition to the sculpture, can you tell us maybe about some of the other highlights in the museum?
Yeah, I think you have to understand first that this museum is the core of a whole little universe of parts of the museum, also at other spots in the city. There are two more satellites in a few hundred meters away. The one is telling the story of Jewish life from the very beginning of the documented Jewish life in our city, going back to the 12th century until the time of the 19th century. Then we have the place at the former Großmarkthalle, which was the trade place for vegetables, where today now the center of the European Central Bank is. And this is the place which is the place of remembrance of the first mass deportations of Frankfurt Jews beginning in October 1941. And the other side now is the complex with the old Rothschild Palace together with the new enhanced part, where we tell the story under the name We Are Now. And these three words, we are now, is and should be a strong statement about today's Jewish life in Frankfurt, and it makes the bridge from the 19th century until today. And of course, it should be a statement for the future of Jewish life in our city. And this is shown now in the new complex, where there is this permanent exhibition on Jewish life here and now. Of course, remembering the development of Jewish life from 1800 until 2020, with many, many family stories, with showing the contribution of Jewish life to the development of Frankfurt, the founding of the university, many other aspects that take place and come together with facts of the Anne Frank family, other things that also connect, of course, with the darkest chapter, the Shoah.
All right, Uwe Becker, the mayor of Frankfurt, thank you so much for this special interview.
Thank you. All the best.
Well, this next topic is for all of you investors looking for opportunities specifically in Israel's startup nation. Smart Funding is an Israeli company that provides a smart and easy way to support Israel's economy. They handpick and vet each company, doing all the hard work so you don't have to. It's a surefire way to reduce investment risk by providing you with the startup nation's top shots in the game. Now, here to talk more about it is Yoad Lipsy, manager of Smart Funding's investor community. Thank you, Yoad, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we've spoke in the past about, different companies Smart Funding is working with, but now I want to talk about Smart Funding itself. What is the benefit of investing through Smart Funding? Okay,
so the main benefit when it comes to investing with Smart Funding is the fact that Smart Funding reduces the risk investments, by making sure that all the companies that we choose to work with undergo a strict screening process, so that investors get a reliable and secured deal. Now, this process is done by professionals and under the Israeli regulation.
And why don't you tell me exactly, specifically, what is involved in this, rigorous vetting process that you go through?
Each company is being examined in all aspects. We're checking everything. We're checking relevant experience, clinical trials, and even the question, does it really provide a good solution?
Okay.
And all the above allows us to provide our investors companies with the highest chances to succeed. In addition to that, it's not that the companies are not operating currently and waiting for funds. They're operating and making a progress as we speak. For example, one of the companies, Ella Pharma, they're in the last stage of getting a €2 million grant within a few months. So this thing will definitely leverage the investment.
And if somebody wants to be an investor, how can they get started with Smart Funding?
So usually the average amount stands at $200,000 to $250,000. However, as part of Smart Funding's vision to be able to provide those opportunities to small investors as well, we do keep a few available spots for small investors, and in that case, it will be $50,000.
So trying to keep it all inclusive.
Exactly.
Yoad Lipsy, thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you very much.
It's finally time to take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight, expect clear night skies with lows averaging 69 Fahrenheit and 20 degrees Celsius. And moving through the weekend calls for mostly clear skies with highs averaging 91 Fahrenheit and about 34 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.38 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Lauren Izzo. Thanks for watching.